63% of students want government-mandated hate speech codes. A Louisville professor blames all Republicans for the riots that happened at Capitol Hill. Plus, in our top story of the week, medical experts are at it again, claiming that assigning gender at birth is hateful, harmful, and transphobic. I'm Addison Smith. This is the Campus Countdown. We've got plenty to get to today. Our number 3 story comes out of UW-Madison, where apparently 63% of students there do not know what their First Amendment rights are. According to a survey that was conducted, these 63% support government-mandated hate speech codes. What these students clearly haven't considered is two things. First of all, what constitutes hate speech? We've seen time and time again that this definition is extremely vague and arbitrary. So what exactly do they mean by hate speech? We need to get specific with our terms and make sure our definitions are precise before we go telling the government to implement them. Secondly, do they trust the government with that responsibility? Has the government not proved itself to be corrupt and untrustworthy? We've seen how the government has handled censorship in, say, Soviet Russia. We've seen how communist and socialist regimes throughout history have done things like burned Bibles and other books. All things considered, government-enforced hate speech codes sounds like a slippery, arbitrary slope, if you ask me. In our number 2 story of the week, a Louisville University professor has a plan to bring about unity and healing. He's really putting in overtime to bring the country together by accusing all Republicans of the Capitol Hill attack and saying they should be forced to, quote, shut the hell up. Professor Ricky Jones of Louisville wrote in an op-ed stating, quote, Republicans, you should not be allowed to speak about being shocked by President Donald Trump or the recent right-wing raid in Washington, D.C. For your words ring hollow. You should be forced to shut the hell up unless whatever you have to say begins with, I'm sorry. You should not be allowed to condemn Trump or attempt to distance yourselves from him unless you begin with, I have helped him and I'm sorry. Really, really, really heartwarming stuff coming out of Louisville. Thank you, Professor Jones. One quick point to make here. The Capitol Hill riots were terrible, and we should all agree on that. What happened was inexcusable. It was an act of violence, and it should not be permitted. And Campus Reform has reported on a story of conservatives nationwide who have condemned the Capitol Hill attack, and good for them. You'd be hard-pressed to find conservatives who approve of what happened last Wednesday, but needless to say, riots are bad across the board, and voices from both sides should be heard, not silence, like Professor Jones is calling for. In our top story of the week, the medical experts are back at it again. We've already discussed in the past on this podcast the brilliant medical minds at Harvard who contrived the term birthing people to substitute for pregnant women, to be more gender inclusive and more tolerant, more loving. Well, the medical experts at Brown University are giving those professors a run for their money. They're arguing that recording a baby's gender on their birth certificate is an atrocious act of gender non-inclusivity, that to do so is harmful to transgender and intersex people. Quote, during the 20th century, as the medical profession assumed greater responsibility for managing childbirth, it also assumed responsibility for completing birth certificates, a process that includes a medical evaluation to categorize each newborn as male or female. We believe that it is now time to update the practice of designating sex on birth certificates, given the particularly harmful effects such as designations on intersex and transgender people. So it is apparently transphobic now to give birth to a baby and see what gender that baby is and then to write it down. Honestly, this shouldn't surprise anyone. For decades now, the left has been attempting to completely erase gender and insist that such biological terms are not inclusive enough. But I must say it's quite strange coming from the party of science, or at least the self-proclaimed party of science. And you hear them say this all the time. Listen to the science, they shout, as they assert that gender has nothing to do with biology and to insist otherwise is harmful and transphobic. What does gender represent then? What does it mean? What is it rooted in? To claim that gender is an arbitrary mood or feeling defeats the whole purpose of gender in the first place. The science is clear. There are only 2 genders, and how you feel on the inside is irrelevant to your biological makeup. That will conclude this week's episode of the Campus Countdown. Be sure to tune in next week for more college craziness. If you're not already, make sure you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Parler. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.